In this video, we'll be gaming on a GPU released in 2014, a 9-year-old graphics card. And the GPU in question is the GTX 970 4GB, or should I say 3.5 GB, a very controversial graphics card back in the day. We'll test this GPU on 10 different games at 1080p resolution. Let's see how far we can push this graphics card now in 2023. This is Gigabyte's version of the GTX 970, the Gigabyte Gaming One. If you're interested in finding out how I got this GPU, check out my previous video. I will link it down in the description. But to summarize, I bought this GPU from a really kind guy on Facebook Marketplace, and he sold it to me for 40 euros. And it was in a pretty good condition, as you can see. It was just a little bit dusty because it's been a while since it's been cleaned. So I cleaned it and repasted it. And surprisingly, even though it was dirty before, the temperatures and the fan speed hasn't changed that much, meaning the cooling system of this graphics card is really good. Let's take a closer look on the model we're checking today. The Gigabyte GTX 970 G1 Gaming is a pretty good looking card. It has a triple fan design with these unique fan blades. They are textured in a way that increases airflow by 23% according to Gigabyte. And to cool this beast, it has 4 copper heat pipes that goes through the entire graphics card. And it has a heatsink that cools all the components like the GPU and the VRAM. I can assure you that this graphics card is not going to overheat. It also has an illuminated LED logo in here, the WindForce edition. Unfortunately though, it only has the color blue. But you can customize like the breathing effect and some effects with the software. But if you don't like the color, you can just unplug this cable to turn off the LED. Gigabyte has given this graphics card a metallic backplate as well, with a stylish G1 Gaming logo. I really like this a lot. This graphics card is built really well. It's also loaded with display outputs. In here you can find 1 HDMI, 3 display ports, and 2 DVI ports. This GPU has a boost clock of 1354 MHz and a base clock of 1203 on OC mode. Then for gaming mode, it has a slightly lower boost clock at around 1329 MHz and a base clock of 1178 for those really graphically demanding games. This GPU is manufactured with 28nm process technology. The memory runs at a speed of 7 gigabits per second, and it has a capacity of 4 gigabytes, or should I say 3.5 gigabytes, with a 256-bit bus, but realistically, it's using 224-bit for the 3.5 gigabytes that is actually usable. Meanwhile, the 32-bit is being used on the 500MB remaining RAM. Here's the complete specification of the GTX 970 G1 Gaming. And here is the test system. Let's start with F1 2022. Running at high preset settings at 1080p, this 9-year-old GPU is capable of delivering an average FPS of 78 and 1% loss of 68. Pretty impressive results if you ask me, especially in this demanding section with lots of cars and rainy weather. The GTX 970 is still alive and kicking. If you're looking for a higher FPS experience, you can dial down the settings. I've had a great time playing with my friend using this GPU. On Fortnite, I have tested 4 different presets. I was curious to see which API is better at competitive and high settings. Let's start with the X11 at high settings. The GTX 970 is averaging around 65 FPS and 1% loss of 30. Kinda playable for casual players, but if you're serious about being competitive in this game, you might want to dial down the settings. And that's exactly what I did. On competitive settings with the X11 API, we have a big jump on average FPS, 144 FPS to be exact, and 1% loss of 54. I believe that's pretty playable, especially in this busy area in downtown Cyberpunk. I mean Fortnite. Now let's move to a newer API, the DX12. Starting with high settings, we're averaging around 60 FPS and 1% loss of 44. Seems like with this newer API, we have a slightly lower average FPS but a higher 1% loss. I think it's a bit better. Let's see if that's also the case with competitive settings. It's similar, a drop in average performance, 127 FPS versus the 144 of DX11, but the 1% loss is higher, at 75 versus the 54 of the older API. If I were to choose, I'd play Fortnite on DX12 with competitive settings. Having higher 1% loss means a smoother and more consistent feeling, so I would go with that. Let's now hop in with Kratos and Atreus with God of War. This was a harder task to run for our 9-year-old graphics card. At the original settings with 1080p resolution, the GTX 970 gave us an average of 57 and 1% loss of 50. Almost 60, but not really quite there. Thankfully, this game has FSR, so we enabled it. With balance preset, this upscaler helped us achieve a higher average FPS at 68 and 1% loss of 60. This is a pretty satisfying FPS for a third-person, single-player game like God of War. I'm quite impressed what the GTX 970 is capable of doing now in 2023. Next up, GTA 5. Pretty much the same age as the GTX 970. And with no surprise at all, the GTX 970 is capable of delivering 84 FPS average and 1% loss of 67 at very high settings with 1080p resolution. GTA 5 still runs great with the GTX 970 to this day. Hopefully, I can say the same thing with GTA 6 once it's released in a decade or so. Overwatch 2. Man, I used to play Overwatch 1 a lot, but this game has just been so disappointing since they stopped updating the original Overwatch 1. And now you're telling me that they're scrapping BVE mode? The reason of releasing Overwatch 2? That's just not good, guys. You know what isn't disappointing? The sponsor to this video. Just kidding. I haven't got any sponsors yet. But really, at least the GTX 970 is still alive and kicking in this game. With high preset at 1080p, without any upscaling help, this 70 class GPU from 2014 is capable of delivering an outstanding average FPS of 155 and 1% loss of 112. Pretty impressive, unlike this game we're testing it. Here we are now with the heavy hitters. Cyberpunk 2077. This game is really hard to run, and I actually feel bad to the GTX 970 for putting it to such a task it can bear with. So with the help of FSR quality, we managed to get 49 FPS average and 1% loss of 36. I deem it barely playable, but it will actually be a hard task to play with these kinds of FPS. Especially if you're used to high FPS from playing easy to run competitive games just like Valorant, like I am. Let's move from fighting for our lives to gain as much FPS in Cyberpunk 2077 to shooting down monsters with double-barreled shotgun in Doom Eternal. At medium preset at 1080p, our mighty soldier named GTX 970 is capable of spitting around 70 FPS average and 1% loss of 52. A very honorable effort from our GPU right here, but for me, a high-paced first-person shooter must have at least 90 FPS to be playable. Maybe it's skill issue. I'm spoiled with high FPS. For casual players, this performance is still good enough to play the game and actually finish it. You can even lower the preset to get higher performance. Here is another heavy hitter, Red Dead Redemption 2. Such a well-made game, but the GTX 970 is really showing its age. At low settings at native 1080p, our little body here is giving us 61 FPS average and 1% loss of 52. That's okay for a third-person open-world game. It's pretty playable performance as long as you're okay with playing with lower quality visuals. Otherwise, you'll really need a newer GPU to enjoy this game to the max. Maybe you can push the textures a little bit, but with the constraint of the VRAM, it will be a bit harder to run. Speaking about high FPS, here we are with Valorant. Valorant gives a highly playable experience with an average FPS of 338 and 1% loss of 242. With the GTX 970, being competitive in Valorant is no problem. The only thing that's limiting your performance is either you or your other components, or just your personal skills at this game. I can tell by experience because I've been playing for quite a while and I'm still stuck on gold rank, even though I have a pretty decent PC. I played better before when I was gaming on a potato. Not kidding. Last but not least, we're checking out Apex Legends. In this game, the GTX 1070 struggled a little bit, but we're running at high settings including the textures, which states uses around 4GB of VRAM. The GTX 1070 gave us an average of 75 and 1% pulse of 49. Pretty playable FPS for casual gaming, but not good enough to be competitive. Lowering the settings will yield higher FPS, so if you're into that, feel free to drop down the settings, but overall it's a pretty impressive result for a 9-year-old GPU. After taking a look at these 10 games, the GTX 1070 is a pretty usable GPU now in 2023. Of course, you won't be running games at high settings. At medium to low settings, the GTX 1070 is capable of giving you a pretty playable gaming experience, if your standards, of course, are set to realistic, since it's still a 9-year-old GPU. Overall, I'm pretty impressed on what the performance of the GTX 1070 is capable of delivering. Guys, remember, this is a GPU from 2014. Check the calendar, it might not seem that far, but it is indeed 9 years ago. Time flies, my friends. But even then, the GTX 1070 is still alive and kicking, especially thanks to AMD's FSR. We can even achieve higher FPS with some penalty in quality, but not as bad as lowering it down manually to 720p or lower. AMD's FSR is such a saving grace for these cards. Just like what we saw in Cyberpunk, with the aid of FSR, it can be played, but at least it's not a slideshow experience. So thank you AMD for bringing this technology even for Nvidia cards. Thanks for watching the video everybody, I appreciate your support. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, subscribe to not miss upcoming videos. If you have questions or suggestions or anything, just type it in the comments. I will reply when possible. Share this video if you think someone would wanna see it. I appreciate all of you viewers of this channel. Take care and see you next time. Bye!